Greg, so help us understand the big picture of mental health. So, what's going on in our society, and particularly since the global pandemic? And also, just what are some of the factors that people are dealing with today?
Well, that's a big question. Um, the um, there's a lot of things you could say about it, but when you look through the lens of mental health and what's going on now in the pandemic, um, it it's it's like our first world assumptions have just taken a huge hit, um, and even for folks in society that don't always take those first world assumptions for granted, maybe more challenged economically or in other ways, there's still this really significant challenge to our sense of safety and our sense of security. Um, there's a real strong sense of vulnerability
Mm,
that has come because of the pandemic, I think. And in mental health, um, that problem is magnified. And so, for people who are already struggling, um, that struggle is magnified. Um, and for people who are kind of teetering, who had trouble coping with things, were just a slight bit overwhelmed, they're over the edge.
mm,
And folks that really didn't think about it, um, who had never really, been challenged with any type of mental health issue, anxiety, depression, worry, excess worry, are now experiencing those things.
mm,
And so, you know, our practice is busy. Anybody working in mental health now is very, very busy because, um, there's this shared experience of the pandemic and what that means for your sense of safety and security for yourself, your family, and your children. And, you know, how are you going to provide in some circumstances? And, so just a lot of challenges. And so, you know, I spend my days, I do medication management, but you can't escape having to talk with folks. Just, you know, not that I want to escape it, but,
right.
um, it makes for very long days when, people, you know, are dealing with the isolation. And, I might be the only person that they've talked to in a week
Mm,
or a month.
mhm,
And so, you know, they get the time that they need. Um, so, I would say, there's a collective um, sense of vulnerability, um, a collective sense of isolation, um, uh, a collective sense of loss. This
mm,
is what I spend a lot of time talking to people about. They've lost a lot of the things that they used to do. They can't do now.
mm,
So things that brought them happiness, even going to Wawa to get their coffee or to Dunkin' Donuts. Some people are not doing that now,
yeah.
or going out or these other things that they would do that help them cope with their lives and brought them joy. Um, they're not doing, or they're not spending time with family because they're afraid to, transmit the virus, or they're afraid to get the virus, and they want to be, careful. So um, there's a real sense of loss, and in that sense of loss, you know, there was a coping thread through people's lives where a lot of those things kept them able to manage their stress, able to go back in on Monday morning, and those things are now not there.
Mm,
And so, you know, the rates of depression, anxiety, and all these underlying things are just,
magnified.
skyrocketing.
Mm,
Um, so, in terms of mental health, yeah, that's what I see. I see a lot of anxiety and a
mm,
lot of fear. Um, So.
Yeah. What would you say, Greg, in terms of how your faith has shaped how you counsel people, how you, maybe from a medical standpoint to from a clinical standpoint, how does that shape your day to day? You're a former pastor.
Mhm.
Maybe you could just speak to that in dealing with your patients.
So, you know, faith really shapes everything that I do,
Mm,
um, or at least I hope that it does. You know, my prayer is, and even before the pandemic, has always been when I work with people, has been, God, please help me to know what their next step is in life, so that I'll be, effective with what you want, not what I want, not necessarily what they even think is best, but help me to be in sync with you. Um, so, when this happened, and it was a significant challenge to everyone, and particularly people in mental health who themselves are also struggling. You know, the faith aspect is very important because you know what I know to be true is that God has not lost control.
mm,
God is still in control,
mhm.
and that's a great reminder, particularly with events of late, um, that
Yeah.
feel out of control. um, you know I am reminded that God is in control, and that I don't have to be God. Because I can't fix all the things. you
Mm,
know I can be a good steward. And so, that faith reminds me, and takes the weight off my shoulders, that I just need to help take the next step and help them take the next step. And, that's an interesting question because, um, faith also reminds me, um, as I think about the scriptures, is that, um, whenever there is great suffering like this in the Bible, there's a great opportunity.
mm,
And, um, the scripture says that God disciplines those he loves.
mm.
And I'm thinking, God, you must love us a whole bunch, these
Yes.
days. Um, and so, I have an expectancy, that I think is brought about by my faith. I think it's important for the Christian to have that. God is going to do something with this pandemic. He's going to glorify himself in a unique way. And it causes me to continually think, God, what would you have me do differently in this new context? How would you have me innovate in my own life, in the lives of people that I work with? So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that.
That's awesome. Greg, how would you, to maybe some folks who haven't necessarily been exposed to the clinical forms of mental health and maybe have either taken the approach for themselves or have heard said to them or someone else, if who is struggling, well, just pray about it. Right.
Yeah.
If someone's experiencing anxiety, depression, so maybe speak to that person. And then on the other side of things, just like you were sharing too, believing in God's sovereignty, that he is in control. How do you grapple kind of with the gospel being sufficient, but also how God has been sovereign to provide tools and medicine and those things when people need it.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Uh, I did a talk a long time ago on, what was the title of it? It was, psychology in the Christian worldview. And because this is a topic, in church. And I think the first thing that I would say is, um, there is an important theological teaching. I'm not sure if it's in the Reformed tradition or other traditions, that says that when Adam and Eve sinned, the entire cosmos was affected.
Mm,
Okay. And, the the garden, there were thistles. They had to work harder to do all these things. There were curses, and you know, death and sickness and illness came into the world. Okay. Um, the thing that I oftentimes have to help people understand is that mental illness is no different than physical illness. And it should be understood as no different than um, hypertension or strep throat or type 1 diabetes or multiple sclerosis or any of these things that you would never say to anybody. Just pray about it and you'll be okay.
Right, right.
So the other thing, another good way to maybe think about it is, I'll say, if they could, they would.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, if people could, you know, somehow affect this change by praying or by doing something, they certainly would, because the folks that I work with, you know, oftentimes are struggling terribly.
Yeah.
There is such a thing. I think it's hard because in psychiatry and psychology, it deals with the mind and the way we think, and there's all these admonitions to redeem your mind, to renew your mind, and to think God's thoughts, to think after God. And so you know I think there's a kind of an overlap where we think that you know we should somehow be able to, if we're struggling, that we're somehow deficient, and
Right.
if you know and we should somehow be able to change this, but it doesn't take into account this understanding that everything is you know everything is tainted by sin.
Yeah.
And there is true neurological deficit, there's true cellular molecular changes that produce you know different mental illnesses that are
Mm.
clinically defined, clinically significant, and will not change without very specific um, therapy modalities and medication. you
Mm.
know Many mental illnesses are not curable, they're treatable.
Mm.
Now there's innovations, and there are mental illnesses that are curable, but many are chronic, and we manage them.
Right.
And so on the other side of that coin, right, you don't want to go and say everything is clinical, you know what I mean, and medicine and secular therapy and therapeutic modalities are the only way, because Jesus is the great physician, right? um, and there are many instances in the scripture where God has healed people. We're told to pray for people's healing.
Mm.
And so for me, I don't see an opposition in those two things. I see a really nice um, complementing experience within myself, where I feel very fortunate to be able to pray for my patients and have this, you know, have the God of the universe, you know, partner with him in, what 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 the theologians would call the dominion mandate, the ability to cultivate and keep and renew, and be a part of healing people in this fallen world.
Yeah.
So whereas there, you don't want to say everything is all spiritual, it's not all secular. you
Right.
know and these are the medicines and the therapeutic modalities are tools in the tool bag, just like the spiritual tools that we have.
Right.
And that's a very robust combination, when you think about it that way. And it helps people to begin to start thinking this way, creates a greater sense of empathy, I think, within people,
Mm.
to understand that if they could, they would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great advice. What would you say, Greg, to the person who is watching this and maybe they have found themselves struggling right now? Maybe they're not firing on all cylinders. How would you encourage them? What would you say to them?
I think probably the first thing that I would say um, would be, can I talk to you?
Mm,
Would you be willing to talk to me? Um, and I don't take that for granted because people make an appointment to see me, but
right.
in the church that's not how it is, and so I would ask the question, you know, can I, step into this place that appears to be pretty challenging for you?
Mm,
And then the next thing I would ask would be, you know, can you share with me? Would you be willing to share with me what it is like for you right now so that I can understand or begin to understand where you're coming from?
mm,
And um, that place is the beginning of empathy, it's the beginning of understanding, and it's the beginning of healing.
mm,
And and what I would say then to that person is, number one, you're not alone.
yeah,
And number two, I'm willing to walk with you through this,
right.
and we can figure this thing out together.
Mm,
Um, and I think that's a great place to start because there's a number of things, depending on what somebody's struggling with, um, you know, of different avenues that we could go down. But the thing to know is that there's nothing that somebody is struggling with right now that cannot be worked on, that cannot be helped, that cannot be, healed or begun to be healed.
mm,
Um, so, for the person struggling right now, I would say those things. There's lots of resources, in
yeah.
the context of the church and the community, and you know, um, and just that installation of hope and care that you're not alone, and that you know, if you're willing, I'll walk through this with you. Um,
Yeah.
that's a pretty winning combo.
Yeah. That is a winning combo. So to the um when someone maybe is kind of coming to terms with this for themselves, and Proverbs talks about how as we seek advice we grow in wisdom, and God has given us a lot of tools, a lot of people with a lot of different advice, and how would you say someone should they go to a pastor in this? Should they go to their therapist? Should they exercise more? I mean, should they do all of the above? How would you encourage them in terms of, okay, if I'm struggling, who do I go to first, and when do I go to those people?
It's a good question. Exercise helps everything, right?
Right.
You know, the trouble is when you feel so terrible that you can't get yourself to exercise. That's a really challenging situation. Um, yeah, you kind of touched on it in the question. There isn't I would not consider there to be a hierarchy there.
Mhm.
I think these things work synergistically together, whether it be the pastor, the professional counselor, the prescriber, um, uh, or other, nutrition, exercise. Um, I think you go with where the inertia is going.
Yeah.
If you're more comfortable entering into getting help at the pastor level, that's where you go.
Mhm.
And then, depending on what's going on, you can, get further, help if needed.
Mhm.
I think if the inertia is that you have a great relationship with your primary care physician, you know, or your trainer, right?
Yes.
Like I think you go with where the inertia is, and in churches, people know who Brene Brown is. She is a shame and vulnerability researcher, and um, the the vulnerable aspect of the person asking for help, that vulnerability is more important than where they enter into the process, because that vulnerability and that asking for help is equated with success.
Yeah.
So, um, you know, and exercise helps everything.
Right.
So, but
Amen.
I
Uh,
had, I had somebody ask me a question the other night about, should we start this med change right now for this young person? And, um, because there's, if it goes wrong, grades could get messed up and, all kinds of things could happen versus waiting until the summertime. And I said a very similar thing. We need to go where the inertia is going, right? If, Joey, that's not his name, is already going a certain direction, we need to go in that direction, because I'm not going to stop the 14-year-old.
yeah.
um I need to get behind them, right or wrong, we'll figure this out. Okay. um and yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
Mhm.
um yeah.
This has been so good, Greg. Thank you so much. I mean, is there any question I didn't ask you, or any final thoughts that you would just say as someone is thinking through mental health and they're trying to learn more about it themselves? In anything else you would share?
The one thing that did pop into my head when I was talking, is it really can't be overstated, um, how people are struggling, and the stress level, and the, you know, even despair. Um, I'm reminded, that even some people, who are not in school now are hungry,
Yeah.
because they were using school to help feed their children. And this is a significant thing. And I really got a glimpse of this the other day as I watched my friends who work in the ER. Still, I'm in private practice, but who work in the ER get their vaccination,
Mm.
and just to hear them talk about feeling hope for the first time in 9 months,
Wow.
I was I was blown away. So, the things that I have thought were the case for all these caregivers and people and things, and the load that they're on, and what's going to be coming toward mental health in the upcoming years because of that. Well, I just saw it so clearly, you know, as people describe tears of joy for not even recognizing that they were hopeless for the last 9 months. They were just under this, heavy, like, am I going to get the virus today and die? Because I'm taking care of all these people. And, you know, that's the thing that, this is a a a big thing. And, like, nobody, alive right now, except for very few, have ever experienced. And, just the the church has a very unique opportunity to be salt and light and love, and, um, to be love, you know, in this time. And that was just, really impressed upon me as I had looked at that and seen those posts on Facebook. And as I reflect and as I talk to people, uh, I would just encourage people to not take that for granted, you know, just to realize that people are hurting, and there's a great, unique opportunity. And if you're hurting, um, to let someone know, because there is help there.
Mm. That's such a good word. Greg, thank you so much for your time and for just sharing your expertise with us. You've not only been a mentor to our team, as just the ways that you've served as an advisor to us, but I know to so many. And so we're really grateful for your leadership and friendship. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.